In the 1970s, the sedan was the standard body style for most passenger cars. This was especially true for vehicles from the so-called Socialist bloc, where, particularly in the USSR, a sedan was seen as a symbol of status. Partly for this reason, the most famous cars from the Socialist bloc in the Soviet Union were predominantly sedans. That's why, more than half a century ago, the Czechs surprised people on both sides of the Berlin Wall by launching a true production sports coupe, the Škoda 110R, unofficially nicknamed the Czech 911. Today, we'll revisit the story of how and why this car came to be, and look back at its successes and achievements. In the mid-1960s, Škoda refreshed its lineup with the rear-engined 1000 MB sedan. By that time, this type of engine layout was already somewhat old-fashioned, yet it remained relevant for many brands, from Czechoslovakia's own Tatra to Italy's Fiat with its 600, the Soviet Zaporozhets, and of course, Germany's Porsche sports cars, including the then-new 901, soon to become the legendary 911. A rear-mounted engine, in other words, worked equally well for tiny city runabouts, large executive sedans, and even masterpieces of automotive engineering. It's no surprise, then, that the Skoda 1000 MB was popular not only in Czechoslovakia, but also in export markets, especially among neighboring socialist countries. However, with this model update, Škoda discontinued one of the few truly non-typical cars for the socialist bloc, the Felicia convertible. This left a gap in the lineup, as Škoda no longer produced anything beyond purely utilitarian vehicles, despite there still being demand for such cars even in socialist countries. Europe was already slowly recovering from the devastation of World War II, and people wanted more than just practical sedans. So, when work began on the new 100 series, engineers planned a place in the lineup for a real sports coupe, not as expensive as a Porsche, but affordable even to ordinary Czechoslovak citizens. This could be achieved through maximum parts sharing with the base sedans, meaning the main difference would be the body itself. Development of the coupe, nicknamed Urko in the Czech Republic from the R in its index, began in 1966, and by 1968, the first prototype, factory-coded S718, was built. The car then underwent a series of tests on East German autobahns, a legacy of pre-war Germany, where it reached 145 kilometers per hour. That was far from racing speeds, but it was respectable for the time, and thanks to revised suspension tuning, the coupe proved more stable on the road than its sedan counterpart. Another prototype, equipped with twin carburetors and an improved generator, was shown in spring 1969. Despite the socialist nature of the state, there was nothing modest about the debut of the 110R. The press launch took place in the main hall of Škoda's training center in Mladá Boleslav, where journalists from various countries could test the new car on roads near the local airport after the conference. The real sensation came in 1970, when the car premiered at the engineering fair in Brno. This was followed by appearances at the Paris Motor Show, then in London and Turin. In just a couple of months, almost all of Europe had seen the new Škoda sports coupe, and soon everyone was talking about it. The sleek proportions of the body, with its smooth lines and flowing shapes, were a pure classic for a car of this type and purpose. A 2.4-meter wheelbase combined with an overall length of 4.15 meters gave the car a clean profile, featuring a relatively long pseudo-hood, the front trunk, and noticeable overhangs. In short, despite its rear-engine layout and two round, friendly headlights without a radiator grille, the coupe's appearance left no one indifferent. It's no surprise that the attractive Czech quickly found eager buyers both at home and abroad. However, Škoda's production capacity at the time could not meet demand. By the end of 1970, only 121 units had been built in a single quarter, and it wasn't until the second quarter of 1971 that regular production began. Even so, the Urco reached the UK and even crossed the Atlantic. In fact, in its first years, most cars were sold outside Czechoslovakia, while at home it remained a sort of prestigious phantom. At the rear sat a water-cooled, four-cylinder engine producing 62 horsepower thanks to twin carburetors. That might sound laughable, on par with the most basic hatchbacks of the time. But the 110R weighed only 880 kilograms. The powertrain, engine, and four-speed gearbox was mounted directly above the rear axle, and aluminum was used alongside traditional materials. As a result, the lightweight two-door Škoda was not slow by the standards of its day. It could accelerate from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in about 19 seconds and reach a top speed of 145 kilometers per hour. For comparison, even the newest Lada in the USSR at the time could not match those figures. For effective braking, the car featured a dual circuit system with disc brakes at the front and drums at the rear. With 57% of its weight over the rear axle, it had good road grip and handled well. Of course, it wasn't a temperamental 911, but even a stock production 110R could rightfully be called a sports coupe, thanks to its natural oversteer. For safety, the manufacturer recommended lower tire pressures, 1.8 bar at the rear and just 1.4 at the lightly loaded front. Practicality was not its strong suit. With a 32-liter fuel tank and average consumption of 8.5 liters per 100 kilometers, it needed refueling every 300 to 350 kilometers. The front trunk held only 250 liters, though a 120-liter compartment behind the rear seats offered some extra space. In truth, the 110R was a car for an individual and their companion, not for a large family. Inside, the design matched the car's purpose, though by today's standards, it might look quaint or even naive. The wide dashboard featured large gauges and, in some versions, wood trim. Later models had a more restrained look. Over its 10-year production run, the model was only slightly updated. In 1973, it gained a pair of smaller auxiliary headlights, headrests for the front seats, and slightly smaller wheels. Soviet motorists got to see this exotic Czechoslovak coupe as early as 1971, when the magazine Behind the Wheel received an orange example for a full year of testing. It could well be called the first true foreign car to undergo such an extended test in the hands of Soviet automotive journalists who managed to rack up about 30,000 kilometers, even taking part in the Inter-Express Rally in Transcarpathia, where the Škoda's crew took 5th place. Supplying the 110R to the USSR was never really part of the plan. According to Soviet propaganda, aimless pleasure seekers were a phenomenon of the decadent West. In the Soviet Union, everything was meant to serve practical and rational purposes. As a result, there was simply no social stratum in the USSR for whom such a light-minded sports car would have been a natural fit. Škoda put real effort into making sure the coupe was appreciated abroad, and not just in the Soviet Union. In fact, the model served as something of a flagship in promoting the brand worldwide. In 1973 alone, an impressive 93% of the 6,000 units produced were exported. There was even a right-hand drive version for the UK market, and individual cars managed to reach as far as New Zealand, Nicaragua, and Kuwait. By the late 1970s, however, demand for the two-door model in Western markets had noticeably declined. By 1980, exports were limited to just Yugoslavia and Spain. In response to these trends, Škoda first added a heated rear window in August 1980, and then in December of the same year, ended production of the aging coupe altogether. In total, 56,902 units had been built over the decade. The decision was understandable. By then, the automotive world was rapidly switching to front-wheel drive and front-engine layouts. Even Porsche wasn't immune to the trend, eventually releasing the unorthodox front-engine 924. The sporting achievements of the Czech coupe deserve a story of their own. In many ways, the entire motorsport history of the Urco was less a carefully planned racing program and more an extension of Škoda's efforts to promote the brand. Thanks to its low curb weight, decent power-to-weight ratio, and well-balanced layout, the Czechs quickly began turning the standard 110R into genuine racing machines, for both rally stages and circuit races. The 180 RS and 200 RS versions were fitted with larger engines, 1.8-liter and 2.0-liter respectively, which, thanks to a pair of twin Weber side draft carburetors, produced between 154 and 163 horsepower. This allowed them to reach speeds of 210 kilometers per hour. The works Urkis were never FIA homologated, but in 1974, the 130 RS was ready, equipped with a 1.3-liter engine, producing between 115 and 135 horsepower. In 1977, at the Monte Carlo Rally, Czech crews driving the 130 RS took the top 2 spots in Group A2. The following year at the Acropolis Rally, they won their class again, this time ahead of Stasys Brundza and Arvydas Girdauskas in a Lada 1600. Škoda's competition cars continued to race in events like the Cup of Friendship until 1982, outlasting the standard 110R by just a couple of years. Thus ended the era of rear-engine Škoda coupes, but not entirely. Just 2 years later, a similar model returned to the lineup under the name Rapid, a car whose story certainly deserves a video of its own. 51 years ago, Soviet automotive journalists wrote, "Overall, the Škoda 110R leaves the impression of a very temperamental and comfortable car with a distinctly sporty character. It boasts good stability and handling, along with an elegant appearance. And perhaps it's hard to put it better than that. This is how the Urco remains in memory, an elegant coupe that embodied the dream of an affordable sports car for thousands of people on both sides of the Iron Curtain."